It's Ken Harbaugh with the MeidasTouch Network. This week, we've got one of my favorite guests back on the show, and an overwhelming fan favorite, Kathleen Belew. She literally wrote the book on the phenomenon of veterans coming home from war, being radicalized through propaganda, and joining or creating extremist groups. The KKK is the most widely cited example. It was started by Confederate veterans after the Civil War. Kathleen is an historian, but the subject of her research is actually playing out right now as veterans from the longest wars in America's history are being targeted and pulled into organizations like the Proud Boys, Three Percenters, and Oath Keepers. You're not going to want to miss this one. Here's Kathleen Belew. My guest today is Dr. Kathleen Belew, an historian and expert on the modern white power movement. We've had her on the show a few times, but I brought her back to talk about her role in the new documentary Against All Enemies. The film tracks the rise of violent extremism in the U.S. and the involvement of military veterans in anti-government activity. Kathleen, it's great to have you back.
Thank you for having me.
You literally wrote the book on the phenomenon of veterans returning from war and visiting the violence they experienced in battle on the country they're returning to. That book, Bring the War Home, did an incredible job of alerting people to this danger, especially in the wake of our wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. But I'm wondering if you anticipated that this time, that violent anti-government, anti-democratic movement in which veterans play a crucial role would have top cover from a major political party.
You know, I don't think there's any way that I could have imagined the place that we have found ourselves today. I started writing Bring the War Home in 2005, so it seems like a different epic in all kinds of different ways. But what was clear to me from the beginning, from the archive of Klansmen, neo-Nazis, skinheads, and militiamen who came together in the white power movement in the late 70s and early 80s, was that warfare continued to play an enormous role in the way they told their own story about what they were doing, and also in the actions that they chose, both violent and nonviolent. And it was also clear to me that that movement had never really had a significant moment of stop in its momentum gathering. From the late 1970s through the anti-government action in the 1980s to the Oklahoma City bombing in 1995. And then Bring the War Home came out in 2018, right after the Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville. And even since then, we've seen just this explosion of activity in all kinds of spheres of far-right activism.
You say that warfare has played a key role in how they tell their story, how they craft their own identity, but it's not always the first person experience of warfare. It's sometimes the mythologizing of warfare, right? I'm thinking of someone like Timothy McVeigh, who had this warrior ethos about him, but wasn't exactly a frontline infantry guy. I mean, he washed out of Ranger School, if I'm not mistaken, or at least Special Forces. Can you talk about the ethos that they're so attracted to?
Sure. And McVeigh is an interesting case because he does serve multiple tours, or maybe not multiple tours, but he's in Big Red 1 Infantry in Iraq during the Gulf War. So he does have some direct combat experience. He does have actual enlistment, which is not always the case. But you're right. He washes out of Special Forces training because he's out of shape from serving in Iraq. He's tremendously frustrated about that. And in many ways, he sees his later white power activism as sort of another route to becoming a soldier, but this time a soldier in a war against the United States, or at least against the federal government of the United States. And the interesting thing about this is, we have a long historical record to look at when we think about ebbs and flows in right-wing activity. So the Klan, for instance, we can look at its formation in the 1860s, and then it has these membership peaks and valleys over the course of the 20th and into the 21st century. And historians have spent a lot of time thinking about what explains those rises and falls. And people have looked at poverty, populism, immigration, civil rights gains. But the best correlating factor, the most consistent correlating factor, is the aftermath of warfare. And that's partly because of the ways that veterans become sort of instrumental in these groups. But it's also because all of us are more violent in the aftermath of warfare. And that measure cuts across people who did and didn't serve. That includes women and children. That includes the elderly. All of us are more available for violent action in the aftermath of warfare, even as these groups are trying to recruit veterans specifically because of their tactical and weapons expertise.
I'm glad you brought that up, because that is something that surprised me when I first read your book. This is not merely a phenomenon of veterans coming home and, as I said in the intro, visiting the violence they experienced upon the society they're returning to. It's the whole of society. You've laid out the descriptor for what happens. What's your explanation for how and why that happens? Is it just the media ecosystem that desensitizes people to violence? Is it the absence or the weakening of family units? Why does the whole of society become more violent?
Yeah, this is the $1 million question, and I think we're still trying to figure this out. The other complicated part is that each of these historical periods work somewhat differently, and the wars are somewhat different. So when we're talking about the global war on terror, for instance, we're talking about a mobilization that looks very different from any other war in our nation's history, both in its duration and in the way that people went on so many repeat deployments through stop loss and through redeployment. And in the new studies coming out that show that people serving in the armed forces today are profoundly more distant from other components of American society than they have been in the past. So for instance, if you live on a post or a base, you're more likely to live there for more years of your life. You're less likely to have friends from outside of that circle of space. And even the activity of the war is not as much in our media and in our conversations as it was, say, in the Vietnam era. We aren't seeing coffins coming home on the front page, right? And this is, we are now post-war on terror, but as this was going on, the last presidential election, we didn't really even debate the war on terror. It wasn't even really in the top 5 list of things that the candidates were discussing.
Right.
So the extent to which it is prolonged and also subsurface, I would anticipate would change some of this pattern, but I don't know how it will change the pattern.
Well, that's one of the mic drop moments in the documentary. It's in the trailer. It's in much of the media coverage of the documentary, where you first lay out in sort of academic terms this phenomenon of violence escalating in the aftermath of every foreign misadventure the American military has engaged in. But then the mic drop moment is when you say, what we don't know, I mean, we know this phenomenon exists, it's well documented. What we don't know is what happens after the longest wars in America's history. After 4 years of World War II, membership in the KKK skyrocketed. After World War I, it did. What happens after 20 years of that?
20 years of that, alongside some of these other social context changes that you mentioned, right? So it's 20 years of the global war on terror alongside a period when our society at large has also become much more violent through repeated mass shootings and also kind of the daily epidemic of gun violence. And our media has become much more polarized. Our political discourse has become much more intensive and, I hate to repeat the word violent, but violent. And all of these things together, I think, are a recipe for concern at the very least.
Well, there's another element that I think might be controlling in a way, which is disinformation. I mean, the speed at which and the economy of providing disinformation now is just so efficient and so scalable that, Mike Breen in the film talks about how effectively we were able to combat Nazi propaganda during World War II, how effectively we were able to combat communist propaganda during the Cold War. We can't do it anymore. And I don't know if it's a lack of will or just the technology, but it is just so easy to tell 100 lies, because you can make up whatever you want for every bit of truth that you want to dispel those lies.
And you can make them very realistic, and you can disseminate them immediately. Right. So one of the things that I study is the way that the white power movement adapted the early internet.
Right.
which is stunningly early. It's in 1983, 84, and they're on something called LibertyNet, which is kind of early computer to computer code word accessed message boards. So it's not the internet proper, but they're anticipating the internet by a couple of years. And one of the interesting things about that content is that it includes sort of the operational material you would expect, like assassination lists, like point systems for which targets are more valuable than others. But it also includes social content like personal ads. So really what they're doing is pioneering social network activism way before Facebook, way before these engines and algorithms made their way into the rest of our lives. So I think people have sometimes thought of these groups as trailing social media, but actually they're really paving the way for a lot of these problems themselves. And there's material reasons that they were interested in that from the beginning, like wanting to get hate literature across borders where it was controlled. And certainly there's also the factor of now that all of us spend all our time on social media, they just have this super highway to do all of this stuff exponentially faster and more effectively. But because I teach about this, I have for a long time been asking undergrads what their experience is with encountering, neo-Nazi content in the comment section of whichever website they're on. And it used to be scattered and somewhat traumatic for students to talk about that. Like, oh my God, I couldn't believe I saw an actual Holocaust denier in the comments on a YouTube video, And now it's like all of them have seen that. They started seeing that in grade school. It's old hat. They know what it is. And it's really interesting how quickly that pivot happened.
What is that telling us? Is it telling us that there are more of them out there, that they're more vocal, that the bots are more efficient and able to evade the filters? Because that could be interpreted a lot of ways. You talk to young people a lot more than I do. What is their experience teaching us?
I think yes to all of that. I think for sure the bots are ineffective. And one problem is researchers of disinformation don't even have the algorithms to use in studies of how to deal with this. So people are, piecing it together with duct tape and hope, Another problem is that there are more. I think the white power movement today is larger than it was when I started writing about this. I also think they are way more vocal and emboldened, partly because they have advocates in government, partly because it has become clear that there is a window of acceptable discourse that includes them. I think the hopeful part, though, is that the people who are being messaged to, the kids in my classes, I think have a much higher literacy around what this is. And they're much savvier in consuming it. To me, the worry has changed from, my college students to much, much younger kids and their exposure. Because I think, I get letters from sixth graders talking about, oh, my friend won't talk to me anymore. And they believe all these things and I can't talk to them. And nothing I can say changes their mind because that's how conspiracy theories work, right? You can't argue someone out. Facts are not the answer.
Right.
So it's a heartbreaking set of problems, and it's one that I think really deserves our sustained attention.
You said the white power movement is larger now than when you started. And that's in spite of the J6 prosecutions, a vigilant Justice Department. How is this movement growing?
So I should just say too, that I am a historian and I am now speaking to you about my hunches and my best guesses. Also, I am of the school that I don't believe we have numbers that are historically sound anyhow, this is a guess. The reason this is a guess is because what I monitor is less about number of people, where I don't think we have very good information. I'm more interested in amounts of activity where I think we do have good information. It's verifiable from outside, and I'm not trusting an organization to clear house it for me. In other words, there's a lot of reasons that at various moments in American history, the FBI has just decided not to keep tabs on these groups, or NGOs like the Southern Poverty Law Center or the ADL have their own reasons from time to time for shifting their focus from one area to another. that's no knock on them, but like there's no organization that has collected the data the same way over the whole run of what we're talking about. So we're always piecing it together. But what we can certainly say is that since 2017, which is Unite the Right in Charlottesville, that's the tiki torch guys who are chanting the horrible things in the square. Since then, it's just been an explosion of activity, not only in the public sphere where we see what's happening, like Proud Boys showing up to Drag Story Hour or January 6th, or some of the more politically facing things that they're doing, but also in the underground, which includes the quote unquote lone shooters, which I would argue to you should never be understood as lone shooters in this movement, and also includes the more coordinated revolutionary activity like people like the Base and Atomwaffen, who are interested in mass casualty attacks or infrastructure attacks or attacks on government. We've also had this spate of attacks on the power grid that has not been officially confirmed as having to do with white power the last I checked, but follows several manuals encouraging white power activists to attack power stations. So in educated guess world, I think we're at least suspicious that this is connected. So all of that to me is sort of a rising tide of activity. We also know that January 6th was an incredibly effective recruitment tool for reaching into spheres of activity like MAGA and Stop the Steal and pulling those activists farther towards white power.
Why was it such an effective recruiting tool? Because I think you have to be in a different information universe. I look at January 6th, I'm appalled. I look at the prosecutions. I think they're getting what they deserve. But the movement you research looks at it in a very different way.
Well, yeah, and it's not just the movement I research. I think even people in the mainstream GOP have rewritten the events of January 6th to think about it as a political prosecution for a largely peaceful protest. I would encourage people to go back and watch the footage again, like the actual footage, not the clipped together Tucker Carlson footage. It is not a peaceful protest. It does involve a lot of people who are not acting illegally. And that's because January 6th is really the collision of three different groups of people. We have kind of the largest group, which is like MAGA, Stop the Steal. Then a smaller group of people from QAnon. And then the smallest group is the white power activists. And those are the people who are Proud Boys and Oath Keepers. They showed up that day in tactical gear. They brought radios. They brought beanies so they could identify themselves through the crowd. They talked about how to smuggle in guns. They made plans to breach the building. They led the breach of the building. So they are, the instigators. And we can see that in the footage just as clearly as we can see that in the legal outcomes. That's also most of the list of people who have been convicted of seditious conspiracy, which is a organized conspiracy, group effort conspiracy, again, to violently overthrow the government or interfere with an election. That's the sedition part. So the fact that, so when we look at the list of people, right, I think it's like, I haven't looked in a couple of weeks. It's in the neighborhood of 400 people, I think, charged on January 6th. And then the list for seditious conspiracy is much smaller than that. But that is still a huge number of convictions for seditious conspiracy, thinking historically. We have hardly ever prosecuted and convicted people for seditious conspiracy as a nation. It's not an often used charge. And the fact that we have convicted so many people on January 6th is, to me, incredibly compelling. So by contrast, when the white power movement in the 1980s was attempting to overthrow the government with, not only semi-automatics, but things like law rockets and homemade claymore mines and homemade napalm, and was organized in a conspiracy to do so that was proven in court, we still didn't convict anybody in that trial in 1988. Even though one of them immediately after the trial started a publication called The Seditionist. So this is the fact that there have been so many January 6th convictions is huge. And it's a huge watershed turning point if the convictions stand. But as people may know, Trump has planned to pardon all of those quote unquote January 6th hostages if he is elected. I think this is part of dictator for a day, quote unquote. Yes. And he has also sort of been deepening his ties, both direct and in dog whistle form, to the white power movement through things like dining with Nick Fuentes, who is a white power Holocaust denier guy, and things like holding the opening rally for his campaign in Waco. So Waco, for people who might not remember, because it's way back in the 1900s, as my students sometimes say, Waco is it's the moment at the end of a siege of an extremist compound when the federal government comes in. There's a huge fire. A lot of people die. Many people see it as a moment of like overstepping by the tyrannical federal government. And it certainly means that to a lot of people, right? It does mean that to some of Trump's base. But to the white power movement, it is also the instigating event for the Oklahoma City bombing. So to hold the rally there is also kind of a direct call out for further violence along those lines. And I mean, as we learned with things like Stand Back and Stand By and the presidential debate that sort of like precipitated January 6th in many ways, this movement doesn't need the people doing the call out to be fully aware of what they're saying in order to take it as a call out. So even if there is plausible deniability by the Trump campaign, I think they have, again, called this to arms.
Well, there can be no plausible deniability when it comes to the promise of pardons. The record on the activities of those convicted is crystal clear. It's on tape. What is the response of the movement in hearing the potential next president say that their members are martyrs and hostages? How are they reacting to that internally?
So I don't monitor internal communications of the movement. So again, we're doing historical guessing, but I'm happy to do historical guessing for you. So one thing we have to remember is that this is not a movement that is univocal about anything except whiteness. And even there's some gray area, for a lot of reasons. But my guess is that we are dealing with a white power movement now that is fractured to some extent between people who would like race war and a white ethno-state, and perhaps even campaigns of genocide that extend beyond a white ethno-state. And that's the old guard model, right? That's what they've said they've wanted to do since 1983. It's been very consistent. It's been marshaled by multiple groups, multiple activists across time. And then on the other hand, the door to mainstream politics has been flown open, right? So there's a bunch of paths forward that did not exist for these groups when they declared war on the state in the 1980s. And that's where we see people doing things like I was reading about a GOP event in Colorado where they were using one of these groups as their like event security, or things like Proud Boys trying to climb the ranks of the GOP in Florida. People getting involved in local and school board elections, people getting involved in sort of these more local politics. That's the footprint of new right style action rather than white power style action. And what the end game might look like, I'm not sure. This is kind of new territory for them. This is different from something like David Duke running for president in the early 90s, which was mostly about, a performative sort of recruitment action. This is actually ascending the ranks in a totally different way. What we do know is that ideologically, there are some fundamental differences between this movement and many of the mainstream values of the United States on either side. Like, for instance, free elections, full citizenship for women and people of color, for homosexual people. And I think there are, long story short, I think that the side of the movement that's interested in race war, that side we need to worry about because of mass casualty attacks on communities of color. The other side, the political facing side, we need to worry about elections integrity and protecting institutions. And those are both concerns now.
Thanks for watching, everyone. Between now and the election, I'm going to highlight a handful of critical pro-democracy efforts that I want you to know about. The first of these is Veterans for Responsible Leadership, or VFRL. It's an organization on the front lines of the battle to protect our democratic safeguards, and to hold accountable those who would dismantle them. VFRL's number one priority between now and November is preventing Donald Trump from being reelected. As an organization led by veterans, VFRL is bringing to bear all that experience and credibility to persuade other veterans and military family members that a vote for Donald Trump is a vote that undermines the very Constitution that those in the military swore to uphold. Here's where VFRL needs your help. If you are a veteran or a family member of one, and if you're looking for ways to make meaningful contributions between now and November, go to VFRL.org. The team there is working on a number of critical initiatives that will make a difference in the coming presidential election. But they need more veteran voices and more volunteers. If you're up for it, go to VFRL.org and sign up. I'll have more updates in the coming months on what they have planned, but trust me, it'll be worth your time. Thanks. What if ordinary people like you and me could change the world with the push of a button? Meet Lomi, the world's first kitchen appliance designed to turn your home into a climate solution by transforming your food scraps into nutrient-rich plant food. Now that I've invested in a Lomi, it's changed the way I deal with my food waste. Lomi is the biggest innovation in the modern-day kitchen since the dishwasher. It's a smart and simple solution to turn food scraps into plant food. In just 4 hours, Lomi transforms almost anything you eat into nutrient-rich plant food at the push of a button. It helps cut the chore of taking out the trash in half, and it eliminates bugs and odors in your kitchen. And here's a bonus. You get to feed your lawn and garden with an all-natural fertilizer that you just created out of your food scraps. Lomi has helped me turn my home into a climate solution. Now I can transform my organic waste into nutrient-rich Lomi earth that I can feed to my plants, lawn, or garden instead of sending it to the landfill. I can help the environment and make my life easier. All my food scraps, plant clippings, and even those leftovers I forgot in the back of the fridge can go back into my garden, helping me grow more nutritious food at home. And now Lomi's new app lets me track my environmental impact, earn points for every cycle, and redeem for freebies from Lomi plus other great brands. Lomi promises to bring you the best possible experience every time you run a cycle. They are one of the only kitchen appliances that has a full, no questions asked, lifetime warranty on all devices. And they don't stop there. Lomi looks after you from day one and beyond. When you purchase a continued subscription, you'll automatically get upgraded to a new Lomi device every 3 years. It feels great to know that I'm creating Lomi Earth instead of waste. I have a basically limitless supply of plant food for my garden, plus I'm helping save the planet. Whether you want to start making a positive environmental impact or just grow a beautiful garden, Lomi is perfect for you. Head to lomi.com/boats and use the promo code BOATS to get $50 off your Lomi. That's $50 off when you head to lomi.com/boats and use promo code BOATS at checkout. Thank you, Lomi, for sponsoring this episode. Most clothes are uncomfortable or too tight or never actually the size you really are, not to mention the annoyance of trying to put a good outfit together. Everyone wants to dress their best and look good at all times because, frankly, it's a confidence booster. So here's the deal. Men's closets were due for a radical reinvention, and Rhone stepped up to the challenge. Their commuter collection is the most comfortable, breathable, and flexible set of products known to man. They help you get ready for any occasion with the Rhone commuter collection, which offers the world's most comfortable pants, dress shirts, zips, and polos. You never have to worry about what to wear when you have the Rhone commuter collection. Their 4-way stretch fabric provides breathability and flexibility that leaves you free to enjoy what life throws your way, from your commute to work to your 18 holes of golf. It's time to feel confident without the hassle. With Rhone's wrinkle release technology, wrinkles disappear as you stretch and wear the products. It's that easy. With Gold Fusion anti-odor technology, you'll be smelling fresh and clean all day long. And on top of that, Rhone is 100% machine washable, so you can ditch the dry cleaner altogether. I absolutely love Rhone. It's comfortable yet professional and has truly become my favorite clothing brand. We're on the move a lot, whether it's jumping from meeting to meeting or catching a flight or an important dinner. The Rhone commuter collection has never let me down. The versatility and overall comfort of the collection is undefeated. Even after I wear it all day, I still feel super fresh because of that Gold Fusion anti-odor technology. The commuter collection can get you through any workday and straight into whatever comes next. Head to rowan.com/boats and use promo code BOATS to save 20% off your entire order. That's 20% off your entire order when you head to RHONE.com/boats and use code BOATS. It's time to find your corner office comfort.
When it comes to those mass casualty attacks, you said earlier that we should be skeptical of the lone shooter moniker.
Yes.
First of all, did you not say lone wolf intentionally? Is that a term of art that we should avoid? And secondly, why aren't they lone?
So lone wolf is a phrase that is used by and popularized by the white power movement.
Got it.
In the 1980s, precisely to make it confusing for the rest of us to understand what's happening and to make it more difficult to tie their actions together. The lone wolf strategy is part of something called leaderless resistance, which very simply is just cell-style terror. And they implement that in 1983. And the idea is that it'll make it harder for federal informants to infiltrate their groups, and that it'll make it harder for people to be prosecuted in court because cell style, right? So no direct communication with leadership and no direct communication with other cells, although everybody's working for a common set of objectives. And just a side note, there are leaders in leaderless resistance. It's just that you can't get them in court. The longer legacy of leaderless resistance has been this idea of the lone wolf, right? It has made it incredibly difficult to organize social opposition to the white power movement or to effectively prosecute, because when these actions look like one-offs, there's very little sort of broad social response. We treat it like we do kind of a mass shooting that doesn't have political content. But when we're in, to be clear again, our country has a lot of those, right? We do have mass shootings that have nothing to do with this particular problem, sometimes even with people using swastikas. So for instance, the Columbine shooting is not a white power action, and can be talked about as the work of like a few disaffected people. But when we're talking about something like the El Paso shooting at the Walmart, which looks like anti-Latinx violence, the Christchurch shooting, which looks like Islamophobic violence, the Buffalo shooting, which looks like anti-Black violence, the Tree of Life shooting, which looks like anti-Semitic violence. And they are all those kind of subcurrents, but they are all committed by white power gunmen who share their manifestos, even through copy and paste. They share the same ideological universe. They share the same goals. They share the same symbols. And if we make those connections, those impacted communities have a much more compelling reason to organize against it and to kind of bind together.
And they're also not lone in the sense that they're seeking to spark many more copycat incidents. Can you talk about the Turner Diaries and the idea of an instigating action that catches fire?
Yes, absolutely. So this book, The Turner Diaries, you will hear about a lot if you start reading about this or if you've already been listening to these kinds of podcasts. So The Turner Diaries is a dystopian novel, or I suppose it's a utopian novel if you're a white power activist. But it comes out in the late 70s in serial, and then it becomes a book in the 80s. And it is, or maybe 79, it is circulated so thoroughly through this movement that people are conversant in it, beginning in the 80s and going into the present. And there's even, like, I remember seeing one clip of a Proud Boy before January 6th telling a reporter, like, go read the Turner Diaries. So this is still in play today. Also, just note to listeners, if you get curious about this, I strongly encourage you to get a nice pirated PDF and don't purchase this book. The money still sometimes goes back to these groups. So the Turner Diaries outlines a solution for the biggest problem that this fringe movement faces, which is what they want to do is overthrow the United States, which is, you know, the most militarized superstate in world history. They want to do that with a very small number of people. And the problem then is what the Turner Diaries describes as a gnat trying to assassinate an elephant, right? Like, how could they possibly do this? And if you read this book in your handy PDF, you will quickly see that it is not popular because it is a great and compelling and gripping work of fiction. It is popular because it is a how-to manual that aligns this project. And what it describes is a series of cell-style terrorist actions meant to, quote unquote, awaken other white people to join in a cause, and then to enter into a prolonged guerrilla war, beginning in California and then working their way east, seizing nuclear weapons as they go to keep themselves from nuclear reprisal. And then through this campaign of guerrilla warfare, sabotage, infrastructure attacks, they eventually are able to provoke a nuclear war between, in the book, it's the USSR, the US, and Israel. And then in the aftermath, they seize control and create not only a white state or a white nation, but an all-white planet through acts of genocide. So this is a profoundly violent vision for how this all could come about. And within this profoundly violent book, we find an attack on the US Capitol that significantly is not a profoundly violent attack. It is only a little teeny mortar strike. It kills a very small number of lawmakers. It's supposed to be a performative action that is to recruit others. So I think this is the plan that they were using for January 6th. Wasn't supposed to be a mass casualty event like Oklahoma City. It was supposed to be a strike at the heart of power that would contribute to forming a guerrilla war.
Have they moderated at all, given the new reality that they have an ally in a major political party? And I'm using they a little too loosely, but is there a realization within some quarters that, you know what, maybe we don't need to break down doors and smash glass if we can occupy the building by getting elected or by co-opting elected members?
So my guess is that that is the friction that we might now find in the movement. So to do a study like the one I did in Bring the War Home, we need to be like 20 years in the future when we get many more documents and archives and court cases. And, you know, you get this big footprint of evidence and you can kind of like parse out those inter-movement squabbles. But for sure, the fact that the Trump administration and then the Trump campaign have embraced these activists, whether it is opportunistically or in common cause, I don't know, but they certainly have not, you know, kicked them out of the coalition or anything like that. That really does change some of the kind of parameters of engagement. So does the fact that there are white power movements, sort of, at least white nationalist movements and far right movements kind of on the march in a lot of other places. So, for instance, Russia might not be the bad guy for the movement now that it was at the time of the Turner Diaries, right? Where there is a lot in common with the Putin regime. So, you know, the changing parameters around the historical context, I think, are one really interesting variable that we'll see play out.
How do you assess Donald Trump's relationships with these groups, especially as that relationship might manifest in the aftermath of the 24 election? Let's say he loses and it's a close call.
Yeah. I think if Trump loses, the thing that concerns me the most is that he seems willing to call upon these groups as kind of extra legal muscle. And honestly, I think we do also have to remember that not all of this is about Trump. Were Trump to suddenly leave the picture for any reason, whether like were he to be incarcerated and no longer able to participate, the movement would not just go back in the box. It is a deeply opportunistic movement that will look for whatever course forward it can find. So I think if Trump loses, they'll use that to say, see, this political system doesn't represent you. Let's all, you know, pick up some weapons. If he wins, I think that it becomes further ingrained into our mainstream political culture. I think either of those things is a troubling outcome.
I have this conversation, it feels like, once a week about Trump as the cause or the symptom. And while I agree with you that the movement precedes Trump and its roots go much deeper than Trump, he still seems like a singular figure. And then I can't imagine anyone else right now on the Republican bench who could motivate people to go to jail for him?
That's an interesting question. I mean, like, I think certainly Trump changed the parameters of the possible for this movement. He created a political world where they could not only avoid prosecution in many of their underground acts, but also could kind of figure out some routes into the mainstream. I think that is absolute. There's no way to sort of undercount what that has meant for this movement. Yeah, I mean, it's a very it's a wild time, that we're living in.
How do you assess the professionalism? And I know this isn't your expertise area, but the active duty military is implicated in some of these movements.
Yeah.
But most Americans still see them as a bulwark, a safeguard against the kinds of activities that they're otherwise afraid of from the militias. Are you worried about infiltration into the military proper?
So, complicated question. I want to take a second to say that when we use militia, I think a lot of people are thinking about Lexington and Concord militia. And this is not that. This is the scary ski caps with the skulls and crossbones painted on them militias. So one scholar has suggested that we should be calling them unorganized private armies rather than militias because they don't respond to anybody. They have no command structure. They have no, moderating influence except for themselves. The militias from Lexington and Concord are, as you know, if you've studied your military history, are now inside of our state and National Guard units. Those are our militias. Those other things are unorganized private armies. Okay. So, but yes, I think a lot of people on both sides of the political spectrum expect and count upon our armed forces as the bulwark between any demagogue, whether it's Trump or someone else, or any kind of like sustained militarized civil insurgency, and the more peaceable United States that we have known and loved, right? Like, and there, I'm just thinking about constitutional freedoms for most of us and the exercise of representative elections, and free elections. The problem has been that so first of all, there is a unsolved friction in American history between two beliefs about sovereignty. One group argues that sovereignty belongs to the people, and therefore the people should be empowered to be able to overthrow the federal government should it become tyrannical. In other words, violence belongs to the people to protect them against the state. And the other group believes that the people are fundamentally sort of anarchical and dangerous and violent, and that the power of violence should belong to the state in order to kind of restrain the worst impulses of the people. So it's, in early America, this is the mob, capital MOBBE, like it's the state versus the mob and vice versa. And we see this come up over and over and over again. Like sometimes it has to do with something like states' rights during the civil rights movement, like what can the government make people do? Sometimes it has to do with like landowners' rights or home rule. But this is like an unsolved thing because it keeps going and we haven't resolved it. We really have not resolved it. So within the January 6th crowd, my guess is that a lot of people were participating in a way that they felt was perfectly legal, because they believe that their action that day is to restrain a tyrannical federal government, right? However, they were also sometimes that day, some of them were also committing seditious conspiracy to overthrow the tyrannical federal government. That's not the same thing. And as we've discussed before, and I think the really compelling thing about Against All Enemies is that we do have this oath of induction when you enter the armed forces that says you will defend the nation against enemies. Is the nation or the Constitution?
Constitution against foreign, support and defend the Constitution of the United States against all enemies, foreign and domestic.
Foreign and domestic. So there is a problem then. I think reasonable people can agree that you can't fulfill that oath and then also be attempting to overthrow the country and take away the Constitution, which is what the white power movement would like to do. But there is this gray area about where this like bounds of tyranny conversation sits. So The problem in the DoD, I think, is threading that needle between those two problems. Of course, you can't participate in the army and participate in upholding your oath if you are also trying to overthrow the government. But you also do have rights to freedom of speech and freedom of assembly and freedom of association and freedom of worship that protect some amount of critique against the government. And I think that has been the hardest part. So over the course of the white power movement, we see the Pentagon trying to solve this problem and not quite getting there a bunch of different times. In the early 80s, white power movement activists were fully stealing weapons from the armory at Fort Bragg, like literal tons. I'm saying tons because it was actually like they weighed tons. And they stole all this stuff. And the Pentagon still didn't prohibit people from from being in these groups until like a decade later. So now, after January 6th, there was a stand down where they put forward a very ambitious plan to curtail extremist recruitment in the armed forces. But enforcing it has been incredibly difficult, and we still don't really have the numbers about how it's going. So this has been a very piecemeal effort, and we do see overrepresentation of veterans and armed active duty forces at events like January 6th.
Well, in the office within the SecDef's office that was charged with implementing some of these changes has been abolished. I mean, the political headwinds that advisor faced, and I know them, were horrific. And I think we've talked about this before, but you have U.S. senators. In one case, Tommy Tuberville saying that he doesn't see, white nationalists in the military. He sees Trump supporters.
Yeah, or patriots.
Yeah, he sees patriots.
It was something like that. Like that white nationalism is fine. People have also, and the political theater and revision around all of this has been stunning from the beginning. If you recall that, January 6th was an ordinary tourist visit. Whatever your politics are, we know it wasn't that. We know it was a thing. There was a thing that happened. And I think just sort of again, we're not figuring out very well how to have a conversation and a real shared understanding of where we stand, which is a big problem for democracy.
Do you think we need a domestic anti-terrorism law?
Okay, so this is tricky because right now, if you bomb something for ISIS, as an American citizen. So suppose that you are born in the United States and you're radicalized and you bomb something on behalf of ISIS, or if you bomb something on behalf of a neo-Nazi party in the United States, those have different sentencing attachments because of the way the terrorism law is applied. That doesn't seem right to me that we would do it differentially like that. On the other hand, as a historian, what I know from the historical record over and over and over again is that every time we expand our criminal apparatus, it ends up impacting communities of color more than it impacts the people that I would hope we're charging in this particular area. So it's a tricky thing. And I think what I come down to is I guess I'm open to it. I think that what we need is the more durable education and language, both in our civil society and in our legal structure, about what white power is so that it can be properly treated in our institutions. Because other than that, all we're doing is creating additional policing mechanisms that quickly redound upon the wrong people.
Right. Do the groups that you study understand their own history? I'd have to imagine that they do.
Yes. So, for instance, Timothy McVeigh checked out of the Mojave County Library in Arizona a book. It's by a journalist, but it's effectively a history book about the Order, which is the white power group that most immediately preceded him. And we know that he did that because he gave that book to Terry Nichols so that Terry Nichols could study. So yeah, these activists are very aware of their history and also of, a particular telling of American history that is part of their ideology. So when we see Proud Boys wearing like Pinochet was right shirts, and calling for the return of helicopters, that's directly about genocide in the Southern Cone against communist political enemies. And, it's just, these are deep imbrications. We could think about Dylan Roof, the Charleston shooter, who was wearing a Rhodesian flag patch. Rhodesia did not exist during Dylan Roof's lifetime. He wore that patch because it's part of the history of the movement. It's one of the ways that we know that he's part of a bigger group of people and he's not a lone wolf. So yeah, the history is really important. And that's to say nothing about how we tell the big stuff like the Civil War or Jim Crow or segregation in the later periods. These stories are all American history that has direct bearing for how we see ourselves in the present.
Well, Kathleen, thank you so much for joining us. Again, thank you for your contributions to Against All Enemies. We're going to walk you out with the long version of the trailer, which includes you sharing, I think, the most important points of the whole film. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me.
3, 2, 1.
There are places in our military where we are trained to start and fuel insurgencies.
That's the same kind of they've been doing their whole career. Now they're doing it here inside the United States.
Anybody who says that this can't happen in a worse way, either they're ignorant or they're part of the problem.
Today, domestic terrorism is the greatest terrorist threat facing the United States.
The CIA has this tool where they measure levels of insurgency, and if you just apply the tool to the US, we are in an incipient insurgency.
Do you want your house back? Take it!
How did I end up on one side of that door and my fellow veterans, how did they end up on the other side of that door?
If you believe the country's under attack, you have a certain set of skills, you're a force multiplier.
They're coming.
It's going to end up the people versus the government.
If you're armed, then you're prepared to defend your family. And if you're not armed, you're dog meat.
When you can convince people that their leaders are not valid, then you give them the excuse to overthrow that leadership.
And that's not new.
The issue is that the people that we are identifying as extremists, they're identifying as patriots or freedom fighters. It almost sounds like I'm talking about terrorism right now.
Everyone becomes more violent in the aftermath of warfare. What we don't know is what happens when we're talking about a 20-year war.
I hope that people are scared, because being scared motivates people.
This is how countries fall apart.
Oh my God!
I could see a civil war.
And this fight, it's far from over, and it may never be over.
I, Lisa Fon,
do solemnly swear
The Constitution of the United States
against all enemies,
Foreign and domestic.
So help me God.
So help me
So
God.
help me God.
It's Ken Harbaugh with the MeidasTouch Network. The film Against All Enemies, which I co-produced with Ben Meiselas and this network, has won awards around the world for its up-close portrayal of America's insurrectionist movement. It premieres in the U.S. on March 29th on Amazon and Apple TV. Go to againstallenemiesfilm.com or click the link below. But don't just watch Against All Enemies. Tell your friends about it. It's one more way to hold accountable those who threaten our democracy. Thanks, Meidas Mighty. Let's use our power well.